websites. The archive of record for threats to press freedom in America. At least 31 journalists have been arrested around the nation just for fulfilling their constitutionally guaranteed duty to seek and report the truth. At least 30 have been physically assaulted, and that's just so far this year. We are not purveyors of fake news. We are not enemies of the American people. So we thought there was no better way to observe Free Speech Week than by hosting this event. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our moderators for this session. Bram Weinstein is a 22-year-old. You look a little old for your age. As a 22-year broadcast veteran, his career continues here locally in Washington as host of the Bram Weinstein Show on ESPN 980. He spent 8 years at ESPN as SportsCenter as an anchor and reporter. Stephanie Siegel is an award-winning news reporter, most recently at WPIX in New York City. She's the current editor of TV Spy. Real Media Group, with which Bram and Stephanie are affiliated, started as a demo reel boot camp in New York City. Now Real Media Group has boot camp programs in 9 cities and operates a social network for new professional broadcasters where more than 200 members get coaching, training, mentorship, and job placement assistance. And with that, I'll throw it to Stephanie Siegel.
Hi, Dan. Thank you. Thank you for joining us here. Hi to Facebook Live. I just want to say that we've been looking forward to this for a very long time, and I'll toss it to Bram to introduce the panel.
Yeah, I think it's overdue in this time, in our divisive times here, that we actually know what the First Amendment means. So I wonder if any of you have taken the time to actually read it. We're going to do that and find out what that means in today's society with our esteemed panel that is here with us today. Vikram Bhagat is the in-house counsel at American Public Media Group and Minnesota Public Radio. Ellen Crook is the VP of News for Tegna and an RTDNA Director at Large. Paul Shafir is of the Media and Entertainment Law Practice Group at Ballard Spahr. Ballard Spahr, did I get that right? Good. And Scott McFarlane is a veteran investigative reporter here in Washington for NBC. Thank you all for being here today. You ever read the First Amendment? You know what it actually says? I'm going to read it to you if you haven't. This is what the First Amendment of the Constitution states. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof and abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So I want to start with this very broadly, and I'd like to hear a lawyer's take on this. In journalistic terms, what does the First Amendment mean? Yeah.
In journalistic terms, I would say that journalists have the rights that all members of the public have, and that if at any point you feel like you're being treated differently just because you're a journalist, that's a huge red flag, and you should contact your attorney.
Yes, that's definitely true in terms of access. I mean, it sort of means, in application to the press, it has meant sort of 3 things. One, it's meant generally that, you know, as Vikram said, the press can't be singled out. They have the same rights as others do. There are also areas in which the press has greater rights than other people simply because of the press. So one important area, and this is connected to news gathering, one important sort of First Amendment right that was upheld in the early 2000s is that if you are provided with information that someone else procures illegally, like a source leaks you information that the source has no right to leak to you, if you're a member of the press and you use that information to report on matters of public concern, you have a right to do so. You know, so the idea is that the First Amendment not only protects your right to speak without being threatened by the government or put in jail, but also affirmatively provides certain protections for the news gathering process. So one protection is that you have the right to receive information as long as you yourself don't steal the information. If someone gives you information that they themselves don't necessarily have a right to give you, you have a right to use that in your reporting. That's a protected First Amendment right. Another area that's more controversial but depends on different jurisdictions is in some cases the First Amendment can give you a right as a reporter to protect your source. The idea is that in order to enable journalism, we want reporters to be able to make promises of confidentiality to their sources, and we will give them a right to protect those sources, such that if a court wants to compel them to identify their sources, you don't necessarily have to do that. It's like attorney-client privilege. You don't have to disclose attorney-client communications. And in some cases, based on the First Amendment, you don't have to disclose confidences from sources. And the third sort of area is that the First Amendment provides substantive protections against legal liability. So if you report something and someone claims it's false and they sue you, under sort of established First Amendment law, the government can't impose liability on you absent certain fundamental First Amendment protections. So one of the most important ones is that if you're reporting about public figures, there's a very, very high barrier to liability. Essentially, the legal standard is something called actual malice, but what that means in practice is they can't impose liability on you just because you report about the president and got something wrong. You have to, in essence, have intentionally gotten something wrong, knowingly lied about the president. And so those are sort of three important areas in which this sort of abstract principle that was just read to you has, from the courts, been sort of articulated in a more precise and specific way to enable reporting and the press to do its job.
I would like to delve into the idea of what's in our parlance now, which is fake news, that has been utilized by elected officials. Ellen, just your general reaction to hearing fake news being placed out there for public consumption as someone who is the head of a major news organization.
Well, the idea of fake news, or really what that has been, is a lack of faith or trust in journalism. And if we're honest with ourselves, that has been bubbling up well before the current administration took office. And if we're truly honest with ourselves, and anybody who has been in positions such as myself, we've seen this coming up, the lack of faith and trust in journalism has been happening. And we need to work on not just battling with politicians, but also take a good look at ourselves and working on becoming more trustworthy also. So we can blame it on others, but I think there's also an important aspect of this, that we have to work on becoming more trustworthy, in spending more time in focusing on greater responsible journalism, in separating those that do not do good journalism, that are not journalists, separating that out from those who do great journalism and that work so hard to seek the truth. What has happened to those of us in the business that spend so much of their day being great journalists, seeking the truth, doing everything that they can to put truth as their true north, have been lumped into this section of people who call themselves journalists, and it has all been lumped together. There are a great section of national journalists that people see every day, and I don't mean all national journalists, but what people see across the nation covering national politics, that have lumped into what people are covering every day and seeing every day in social media, that has hurt what true journalists are. And we have to really begin as an industry to separate that out and to spend more time sponsoring and fostering responsible journalism.
She's on a macro view, you're on a micro one, as you are literally investigating stories every day. How do you deal with the idea of fake news being out in the public?
The problem she described is not only accurate, but government officials recognize it and are capitalizing on it. I suspect a growing number of Paul and Vikram's clients, a growing number of Ellen's employees, a growing number of student journalists and full-time journalists watching this are experiencing what I'm experiencing, that this antagonism towards media is not just a federal Washington, D.C. thing. It's going down to state legislatures, to county councils, to local sheriffs. They recognize there is a political benefit to smacking us around a little bit, that some constituents do not hold media in high regard, so being antagonistic toward us is politically beneficial. People are recognizing that now. So as an investigator who speaks with government officials, I recognize the kickback is much stronger now than it was when I started. I know Ellen's reporters feel the same way, and students who are learning this recognize that when you become a journalist, you do become a target to government officials who recognize collectively we're not culturally popular with all people.
I want to read a tweet from the president as well, because I think it's a macro issue that I'd like to hear what you all have to say about it. He wrote about a week ago, with all the fake news coming out of NBC and the networks, at what point is it appropriate to challenge their license? Bad for country. Can you weigh in legally on the idea of publicly threatening the license of NBC?
My understanding is that NBC does not have a license, so that would be the first legal problem. But beyond that, obviously, to the extent that there was some ability to harm NBC through regulatory action based on the content of NBC's reporting, that would be a pretty classic First Amendment violation. We don't have good law to address that kind of issue because that has not arisen, and it's not clear. I mean, it's not clear what legal vehicle there would be to challenge it, but if there's something that doesn't fit into the recognized understanding of what the First Amendment is, it's that, and the courts would find a way to sort of find a vehicle to deal with it, but there's no license, and so far there's no action.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to the extent that NBC has a license, I'm sure NBC owns TV and possibly radio stations that have FCC licenses. So if, he was talking about going after that, there's a very well-established regulatory structure in place, and there are ways to take away licenses, but that usually involves broadcasting obscenity, broadcasting things that are in violation of FCC rules and regulations, not broadcasting things that are, unpopular or not nice.
So any reaction to someone who works for NBC to
We have a
hearing?
license. Ultimately,
Now you do.
That's right. We still have a license. But ultimately, this is a broad brush you're painting with. And as an investigative reporter, I have to become more cognizant of the fact that when I appear on camera challenging a government official who is accused of misconduct, I have to recognize that government official has spent years or decades cultivating favor with my audience, with his constituents. And I may not look good going after a government official. I have to do it anyhow. But that person may be more popular than I am because the president's tweeting, because other people are using the phrase fake news. Our popularity, our favor with the audience is more at risk than it ever has been. That makes our jobs more difficult.
It's an interesting ability to communicate that the elected officials have now with social media, and of course the president has a large following, so he can get his message out instantaneously when any story comes out. So how do the news organizations deal with the ability to react that quickly to what is being put out on television or in print?
Well, if you're asking me, again, one of the things that we have to do is we can't just keep this argument going. We're not going to win that argument. We have to work on creating journalism that wins the trust back of the people that we cover.
How do you do that?
We have to work on great journalism, on covering our communities and creating solutions in our community, covering our community in ways that reflect issues that they care about, having our community see themselves in our stories rather than just covering every crime that happens in their community. Being able to, one of the sayings that we say at Tegna is the greatest way to gain trust is to be trustworthy. We are not going to win this battle of just saying we're not fake news. That's not going to work. We have to work on creating journalism that wins the hearts and souls of our community. That is the way to get through to the other side of this battle of fake news.
We have a number of examples of issues through stories and questions that were asked. We collected some of them from the Excellence in Journalism event in California a month ago, and Stephanie's going to help us pick out some of the ones that piqued our interest.
Yeah, I mean, in order to get to that place where people trust us, you need to know your rights and how far you can push. And our first question has to do with reporter rights on the streets. So take a listen.
The question is, as a reporter, what are my rights when I am in public or in the streets and I'm reporting and someone's telling me I can't do it?
So this is sort of, reporting 101. We know basically that sidewalks are safe, but that is really general and not necessarily always accurate. Vikram, can you talk about reporter rights on the streets beyond sidewalks, maybe your top 5 tips for student or new professional journalists when they're going out there for the first time?
Sure. As I said earlier, you should never be treated differently just because you're a journalist. I'm not a journalist, so I have every right to stand on the sidewalk, go to a public park, go to any public forum I want to. That right doesn't go away just because I happen to have a camera or a video camera or a notepad. However, there's always exceptions. For example, there are certain public forums like a public high school. That's intended primarily for public high school students and staff. The public high school does have a right to tell me, no, we don't want you here right now. And if someone tells you that, you're not being singled out because you're a journalist. Generally, it's usually because they have every right. So what I would recommend is if you do have any doubt or something seems off to you, the first call you should make is to an attorney. I mean, most media organizations have in-house counsel. You should get their emails, get their cell phone numbers, have them with you at all times. If your news organization does not have an in-house attorney, they usually will have an outside attorney or an outside law firm on call, on retainer for you. Get those numbers. If you have neither, there are lots of great free resources out there. Reporters Committee for the Freedom of Press is fantastic. Student Press Law Center. These places have like websites, hotlines. Anybody can access them, especially independent freelance journalists who don't have access to legal help. The other issue I think to keep in mind is that rules vary from state to state, from city to city. So a lot of reporters want like bright line tests, bright line rules. It's always like this, it's always like that. In law, there's always an exception. There's always an exception to the exception. It goes on and on and on. So if there's any time that you feel like you have a doubt, pick up the phone, send an email, and be sure before you keep going.
And I think that's a secret to this. For any journalist that's listening out there, if you're new to the business, the more experienced you are, the more they learn this secret. You do not have to know all your rights. Here's the secret you need to know, and I think Scott will attest to this. You need to have a circle of people that you contact to ask. And the more experienced people I know, the greater their circle. When you're first starting out, you think, oh, I don't want to let anybody know that I don't know, right? And the more experienced you are, the more you get those people in your phone that you'll be, I'll just ask. I was a news director for 22 years, and I still would get a lawyer on the phone anytime something came up, and I would check. You are a journalist. You don't have to know all of your legal rights all the time. It is best. Some of the network investigative reporters, all of the network investigative reporters, have a team of lawyers that help them know their rights getting into stories. And they pre-plan when they go into a story. So having managers and editors and lawyers that you can ask, even when you're out on the street, to ask, hey, I'm about to go into this situation. What do you think I should do? Is probably the best advice you can have.
Well, that leads me to our example of this. WXIA reporter, chief investigative reporter, Brendan Keefe did a piece where he was in a pretty heated confrontation with somebody when he was saying, no, you can't shoot on my property because it's private. He was standing on public property. Let's take a look, and then you can explain the context of that.
Mm-hmm. You investigate. I don't have to tell you that. It's okay. No, I'm getting a picture. No, sir. Call the police. Get your ass out of my property. I am on public property. You call the police then, or I will call the police. Oh.
A towing company manager tries to block us from getting a picture of an impounded car.
I got a man up here taking pictures. Sir, I don't want him taking pictures. Our yard. Sir. He don't have authorization.
Sir, this is public property. Please step aside.
Not shooting that way. Turn around.
No.
Turn around!
The car was on his property, but we were on a public sidewalk.
Stop taking pictures to the police!
Sir, I do not have to take your unlawful orders. What's so special about this particular Toyota? It was impounded by Clayton County Police from owners Michael and Michelle Pierce. The couple runs a thrift shop, and they routinely buy the contents of unpaid storage units. Their $1,700 bid won an auction for the Toyota.
And then we found out it was...
So what you didn't see is that exchange went on for, what, 5-6 minutes? And the gentleman got even more aggressive and volatile, and the police had to come. And I'd say, yes, you have to call, you have to have a support system, but instinctively as a reporter, you have to know that you just have to keep calm and stand your ground, and you can't be bullied. So I think it's a combination. Can you, tell the audience here and on Facebook about that story and how Brendan ultimately.
And Brendan has decades of experience, but as Vikram and I were talking beforehand, he did a little bit of pre-planning and made sure that that sidewalk was public before he went in, double-checked it with lawyers and managers before he went to do the story. So he did get support and advice going in. So he knew going in, he didn't have to check, wait a minute, is this your sidewalk or is this the city's? You know, to check and made sure that he knew his ground before he went in and was able to know his rights. That if you are shooting on a public property, even though he was shooting into the private lot, that he had his rights and was able to hold his position there with it. You know, and one of the things that we always tell people too: be polite. Don't escalate the situation. You know, show your it's hard. Yeah, it is hard sometimes. But yeah.
Right. And the basic legal principle there is, you know, a lot of times lay people will think, well, you can't photograph this because I didn't give you permission to photograph this. I mean, the basic principle is you have a right to report truthful information, except if it's private. So in this context, the car obviously isn't private because you can see it with the naked eye from the street. If you were using a telephoto lens that went into somebody's house, you get into more difficulty. If you're using some kind of recording device that, you know, that can capture private conversations, you're potentially in more trouble. And what counts as public or private in this context is a legal question. But the intuitive idea is, again, no one has a right to prevent you from publishing or reporting on truthful information unless it's private. And that's sort of the lodestar, the concept of privacy there.
And the irony of it, that the story had nothing to do with that man's lot. It had to do with something else.
Let's take a look at another piece. It's similar, but a very different set of circumstances, and it involves filing while actually on private property, and it also came from a Tegna station.
Credentialed to observe legislators here in Georgia wherever they meet to discuss laws. He's calling for backup.
Alex staffers had 4 off-duty sheriff's deputies standing by while we talked with the group's director of communications.
Can we do an interview with you?
Actually, no.
Why not?
If you'd please turn the camera off.
No, we can't turn the camera off. You know, that's one thing we don't do.
Okay, well then I'd like to have you escorted out of the building, please.
Okay, I'm a guest of this hotel. I'm actually staying here at this hotel.
You are staying at this hotel.
So here's the question is, if Georgia legislators are meeting here, we're credentialed right here to see Georgia legislators making laws. Are they discussing things that could become law here?
Georgia legislators are here participating in discussions where they're learning from legislators from others.
So why can't the people who elected them see the process?
This is a private meeting.
A private meeting paid for by whom?
By our members and donors.
Our lobbyists, correct?
No.
Are you here for this conference too? Are you really?
We met 2 lobbyists and a state representative from New England in the hotel bar the night before and recorded our conversation.
You have to pay your own way?
Well, on a trip like this, that's where you would come in, man. On a trip like this, I'm the state sheriff of Ballard.
Yeah.
And I look for financial supporters,
right?
Lobbyists, people like, to send us like a couple $1,000 every so often. That gives me money to help those folks with. Now, the other hand,
and we pay more to be here, so it helps support them.
And you do.
I see. So the lobbyist fees to come to the event actually help subsidize the legislator coming here.
Our lobbyists, correct? No. They're not lobbyists? The ones that we recorded in the bar last night aren't lobbyists who are here members?
He signals to the sheriff's deputies.
All right, I'm a guest of the hotel, sir.
Not for long.
I'm here, a paying guest of this hotel, sir.
We'll take care of that. Escort you up to your room and get your things.
Did we violate some law or something? I mean, are we violating a law here? Don't say nothing. One of the Georgia senators who sponsored that asbestos bill, Renee Unterman, told the 11 Alive investigators she later dropped out of.
This one's a little trickier, I think, than the one we saw earlier with someone literally on a public street. Can you kind of take us through it was spelled out, but can you take us through some of the background of what happened there?
Sure, there's a lot to unwrap there. But again, a lot of pre-planning with lawyers and managers to think through how Brendan and his team could do that. One thing was we knew we would be on private property there, so by thinking through that ahead of time and becoming a guest, they actually went on the convention registration and became a member of the event. It was open to the public. And so by becoming a member of the event and registering on the hotel, and did not, following TEGNA guidelines, did not misrepresent themselves, went on under their own name, did not do anything by lying about who they were or anything like that, that they were able to go on in the hotel. And so that, again, was pre-planning, being on public property as a guest, or private property as a guest, that allowed them to be prepared when they told them to get out of the hotel.
They still are using cameras. They're filming there. Can you take us through the legalities of that part of it, that we understand they became guests, got themselves into the building, but they're still using cameras here?
And so when they told them to stop at a certain point, they did stop shooting. But if you're at a hotel and you're shooting pictures at a hotel until someone tells you to stop, you can. How many people have taken pictures on their vacation in a hotel, right?
The one legal point I'd add to that is, as a journalist, any representation you make to gain access to a space is binding on you. So in that situation, I'm sure this wasn't the case, but if in order to register for the meeting, you had to sign something saying, I will not disclose the contents of the meeting, I will not take any pictures, I will not disparage the organization. If the journalist had done that, then those commitments would really be binding. You can't sort of cross your fingers and say, but I'm a journalist, I didn't mean it.
And they were very careful to make sure that there was nothing that said that or had that in there.
Right, and that can sometimes be a sticky point. Any contracts you enter into, even if you're doing it to facilitate your news gathering, are nonetheless contracts that are binding, just like any contract.
We're going to see a piece of yours in a moment, but just on this topic of, and this reporter and their camera person knows they're going into what will be a confrontational situation. How prepared do you need to be for that moment?
You tend to want to talk through the possibilities with your photographer. If for no other reason, you want to get good photography, and you want to tell this story illustratively through the camera. I think what the work from TEGNA underscores is that to get information that's not choreographed from a government official, you do need some type of leverage. And the camera, and the rolling camera, is a remarkable piece of leverage. You really can get something out of government officials they don't want to give, because their game's going to be thrown by the rolling camera. But you walk through these things in advance because you want to make sure everything shows up photographically, or else the whole plan doesn't work.
What I loved about that piece is they had such tight communication that when Brendan was getting confronted, I think he must have put his camera down a little bit, didn't stop rolling the whole time, and that's so key in the storytelling process because you can give context. Did you have something to add? I saw you nodding your head. Oh, okay.
Let's get to our next student question.
So this pertains to public records. There are different laws locally, statewide, and then federally. Let's take a listen.
I'm Nick Kelly. I go to Mizzou and I work for the Columbia Daily Tribune. My question is, what do you do when people keep delaying FOIA requests and not getting back to you?
That's somewhat redundant because they usually delay FOIA requests and they'll get back to you. Exactly. I like that Nick's is going to a great school and already thinking about public records requests, because a couple things come to mind. First of all, it illustrates one of the beautiful parts of government, that governments at every level have two types of characters. They have political characters, those who are elected to office, and it has career civil servants. And at many levels of government, it's the career civil servants who process public records requests. And they're somewhat immune to this fake news thing. Career civil servants have no political gain, so they tend to take records requests, do them judiciously, do them honestly, and do them as expeditiously as they can. It's their job. So public records requests are a great way to build that leverage, to get information from government that it otherwise doesn't want to give. They're delayed a lot, sure, because a lot of public records offices, I know the federal FOIA offices, are overworked, understaffed, and under-budgeted. So there is a genuine reason behind the delays. It's not a motivation of them to delay, it's a necessity. But there are ways to get around it. First of all, appeals rights for FOIA are rarely used. You can appeal a rejected public records request or a delayed one. You'd be surprised how often the appeal actually works. What's more, you can require or ask for an expediting FOIA, an expedited public records request. They often will grant that if you give them a reason. And a lot of people don't take the time or trouble to give them a reason.
And as specific in your request as possible, I think also helps. Too often our requests are too broad, which burdens the request, and so as specific as you can be helps. Sometimes very broad ones gives you better stuff at the end, but as specific as you can be will expedite the request.
And on a practical level, I would suggest whenever you send an email or send a letter asking for documents, always CC your company lawyer and say at the end of the letter, I am CCing my company lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be amazed what that does.
Yep.
If you do not get a response in the time that you expect to get one, talk to your attorney and have him make a phone call. I have made many phone calls to state, local, county officials. Magically, there's a document production a few days later. Another thing to keep in mind is it's very important to know the laws of the state in which you're operating. California, for example, requires the government to respond to a request within 10 business days. It doesn't mean they have to produce the documents. It just says they have to respond. And the response could be, we have nothing for you. We need more time. We have stuff, but it's subject to an exemption under the law, so we're not going to produce it. We're going to produce some. Here it is. We're not going to produce the rest. There are any number of things. Some other states, like Minnesota, there's no deadline. So it's very important to know what the public records law of your particular state is, and your lawyer can help you with that.
If there's no deadline, how do you navigate that?
Good question. That's when, after a reasonable time, you start getting, if you don't get a response, you need to get your lawyers involved and have them make a phone
What's
call.
a reasonable time if there's no deadline?
I think California's 10 business day standards is very reasonable. I would use that.
I had 2 warnings. First of all, note who the public records officer is. If it's the same person who's the public affairs or public information officer for an agency, bring a level of cynicism into this, because they also may have other motivations beyond just giving you the records you want. But I also put my cell phone number on every FOIA request I put out and encourage the FOIA processor, call me if I can help do anything to make this easier for you or to expedite it. You'd be surprised how often they take you up on that offer, and it does move things faster.
I have some strong TEGNA journalists who actually make it a practice that they have a certain day of the week that they send their FOIAs out, so that they're not just doing it when a certain story comes up, but they are regularly making sure that they are holding certain people in their certain aspects of their government accountable by making sure that they are asking for certain records on a regular basis.
So you're ready for when the breaking news happens. We all cover active shooter situations. Why not proactively FOIA every police department to ask if they've done active shooter drills?
Right.
And if so, how did they turn out? Were there closing memos about them? Before there's a school lockdown in your community, why not ask by FOIA every school district in your area how many lockdowns they had last year? So you can provide context and contours to that breaking news reporting. Providing a FOIA day, like TEGNA is wise enough to do, helps prepare your news outlet for a broader, better sense of breaking news coverage.
And Scott, plug your ears. But one of the good things is you can FOIA people's emails, people's texts, your county government, holding them accountable to the correspondence between each other during public meetings. Those are the things that you can really find out what's going on in your local governments.
That's a great segue. Scott, your story that we're about to watch, you made a lot of public records requests for this piece. It's about government workers who were doctoring their time cards in order to gallivant, go to Vegas, a number of other things, and while still getting paid. It's a 3-minute piece, and we're going to watch the whole thing. So let's take a look, and then we can talk about it after.
Some of them went golfing, or gambling, or just gallivanting around town while on the clock. Valtina Pierce admitted doctoring her timesheet to play hooky from her job at the Environmental Protection Agency for a total of 5 full work weeks.
I'm Scott McFarlane with Channel 4.
It went on for 2 years, costing taxpayers $15,000 for work she never did, before the feds caught on and prosecuted her for fraud.
We would like you to stop it.
John Beal, a high-ranking EPA official, executed a bigger scheme, pretending to be a CIA agent as a way to get permission for an extra paid day off work each week. About 13 years passed before investigators discovered Beal didn't work for the CIA and that he'd burned taxpayers for hundreds of thousands of dollars in free vacation time. His work emails obtained by the News 4i team show his CIA scheme. He tells colleagues, "I'm off to points unstated, just leaving Langley." Alan Williams investigates these cases for the EPA's Office of Inspector General.
This isn't as rare as we think it is.
No, it's not rare. It's not rare. I like to say here at EPA, I think it's just a fraction, a small percentage. But again, I don't know what I don't know.
Internal government audits obtained by the News 4 I-Team reveal in the past 3 years, more than 60 workers across the federal government have doctored their timesheets to sneak out of work while on the clock.
And our review found this happening at federal agencies throughout our city, not just the EPA, but also at the Pentagon. About a half dozen cases at the Department of Transportation, at the Labor Department, the Smithsonian, NASA, and all told, we found this costing taxpayers about $1 million just since 2012.
A jury convicted Herman Ransom, a top official with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, of theft for going to the casino while on the clock. At the General Services Administration, a D.C.-based worker worked on his swing at a local golf course, bragging in an email, "Everyone's in," and he said he was using slick leave to get out of office. Williams says government managers should be cracking down on these no-show workers.
Had the manager or the timekeeper did their due diligence, then they could have, prevented this from going further.
But that wouldn't have stopped Valtina Pierce. Why? Because she was the timekeeper at the EPA. Pierce managed her office's timesheets, and prosecutors said she figured out a way to doctor them.
The agency isn't going to police themselves. That's why they need an internal watchdog, and that's the Inspector General.
But David Williams of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance says many of those inspectors general are underfunded. The I-Team's review found nearly every major federal government inspector general recently instituted hiring freezes or reductions in training or travel because of tight budgets, even though those offices save money by reducing fraud.
$1 spent with the Inspector General, they can save upwards of $12 to $20.
In the meantime, most hard-working civil servants risk getting a bad rap.
I still think, maybe we just touched the tip of the iceberg.
Because of those gambling and golfing workers goofing off on the clock. Scott McFarlane, News 4 I-Team.
First question, you can weigh in, but how long did it take you to put together that piece?
To get the records was 99% of the job. I mean,
Okay.
once the records came back, telling the story was simple.
Sure.
First of all, reporter rights for FOIA, reporter rights for public records, do not exist with Congress or many state legislatures. Let's begin with that. You can FOIA government, but Congress wrote themselves out of the FOIA law when they drafted it. You can't FOIA Congress, and in many state legislatures and state capitals, you can't do that either. So let's begin with what right you don't have. The right you do have is to request from any government agency you cover, whether it's a school district, a city transportation department, or the U.S. EPA. You do have a right to ask them for any cases of misconduct they investigated or their Inspector General investigated. And they're required to give you a closing memo, or what they call an ROI, a report on investigation. They have to tell you what cases of misconduct happened in the past year, what they found, and what it involved. They may or may not give you the name of the individual, but they might. And in the case of this story, we decided to pick a few government agencies, and we work in Washington, D.C., so there were a few to choose from. So we picked 20 of them, and we asked for all closing memos of misconduct, time, and attendance fraud. We found 60 cases in just 20 agencies. That is a subdivision of how much government there is in Washington, D.C. But recognize, no matter what you're covering, local, municipal, state, county, or federal, government agencies do have to give you, if you ask for them in public records requests, the stuff they did wrong, the misconduct or internal investigations they closed. Again, public records are leveraged to get information from government they don't otherwise want to give.
Just out of curiosity, why did you pursue that?
Well, we saw a couple cases go through the courts. It seemed odd to us. The guy who pretended he was with the CIA, his case became somewhat notorious here because he was prosecuted in the U.S. District Court, and the prosecutors gave us all a heads up. And my question was, is this a one-time thing, or is this a regular thing? And a couple of inspectors general said, you'd be surprised how many you'd find. So we wanted to find how many we could find.
Let's talk about some of the things that were utilized in that piece and some of the other things. I'd like to have our lawyers here weigh in on some of this as well. You talked about acquiring emails. The legalities behind acquiring emails, what is that?
That's varying by jurisdictions. And it's working through the courts right now. I mean, the general rule is that if they're work emails, then they're fair game, right? I mean, there are various protections that can apply, and
they will apply.
Yeah, the government can assert.
Work to work, not work to personal.
Well, that's the next question. But yeah, if government emails are implicated by request, they can say this contains sensitive information for various reasons, but that's at least the kind of record that should be subject to FOIA. The more sort of difficult question working its way through the courts right now is what about when, and this would never happen, but a government official does government business over their private email. I don't think that's ever happened. But if it happens,
Paul cracking a joke.
There might be laws to deal with it, and that's varying state by state by state. And I think increasingly the answer is, because just everyone does that, those things would, in theory, be subject to FOIA as well.
Bram, the best type of email record to request. Think back to the last big story you did that somebody in government was not terribly fond of or had a problem with. FOIA the emails about your story. FOIA the emails that include your media organization's name or your name, because you'll get a real honest glimpse of government when you actually ask for the FOIAs about something that they didn't expect or that didn't go right. And what's more, they can't reject that FOIA or say they came up with nothing, because if you ask for the FOIAs that include your name or your media organization's name, you already have a bunch of those, all the ones you sent. So you know if they're being honest with you and giving you honest records, and you can use that as leverage to get very indicative communication from government about a problem.
How about, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, also it's, it's on the burden is on the government to prove why they're not going to produce something. So if you request something, you should assume that everything you requested will be produced. And if it's not, they need to justify why that is. And they may be legitimate. There are lots of exceptions to public records laws throughout the country. But the minute you get that, show it to your lawyer and say, is this legit? Because there's a lot of things in California, for example, records produced in the course of litigation are exempt from production, but not just any record related to litigation. There's a difference. And so you have to make sure that the exception they're citing is not a pretext for not producing what you want them to produce.
How about hidden cameras and recording phone calls? Can you discuss the legalities behind those?
Sure. I mean, that varies tremendously state by state. So you need to, and this information is all easily available. But if you want to go to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, I think is a great resource for this. But they will tell you state by state whether it's a two-party consent state or a one-party consent state. One-party consent state is as long as one party to the conversation consents to recording, you can record. Two-party, both parties have to consent. In terms of hidden cameras, typically the issue with hidden cameras is the same issue with recording conversations, which is simply the audio thing. And one important point to make, this is counterintuitive, or to keep in mind it's counterintuitive, is the violation, there are two sort of potential separate legal violations. One is in publishing the contents of a private conversation. But, and this is the crucial point, even recording a private conversation is a violation. So I had a journalist recently ask me, like, look, I just want video, but I can't disable the audio on my camera. Is it okay if I record it, even though I never intend to publish the audio? And the answer is it's not okay. Maybe they don't find out. But as a legal matter, simply recording the private conversation, if it's a two-party consent state, is a violation. But it has to be a legitimately private conversation. Again, this gets back to you're on the street, someone's yelling at you, you can record that. There's no expectation of privacy in yelling at someone across the crowded street. But if it is a conversation to which a reasonable expectation of privacy would attach, and it's a two-party consent state, you can't record either video and audio or just audio. The other issue with hidden cameras, and this again varies state by state, is sort of what you do to gain entry, right? The extent that you sort of make representations that cameras don't exist, and in fact there are hidden cameras, that can potentially create trouble for you as well.
And this is something that really requires a lot of discussion, and particularly, in TEGNA, we really say, our policy is that all other avenues have been exhausted. That's where you really lose trust in people, if you are willy-nilly using hidden cameras. One thing, how do we distinguish between is it a private area or is it not? You're going into an area in a hospital or a waiting room. We've done undercover stories on the opioid crisis, and is an area of a hospital room considered a private area? Some people would say yes, some people wouldn't. I mean, it really takes such discussion and analysis of how we're going to go about doing that. So we really only use hidden camera if we feel we're truly exposing wrongdoing, that at the end we're making our community a better place, that we're going to make something better at the end, and we've exhausted all efforts. And we always say, is that something that you could just go shoot with your phone? You know, so you know your rights, but also ask, should you be doing that?
I'd like you to weigh in on the ethics of it as well, because that is a big key to this entire thing. Knowing what you can do and knowing what you, or where your comfort level is of what you should do are two different things.
I think it's a good question, and I think it's a great point, because just because you have a right doesn't mean it's wise to exercise it. Yeah, hidden cameras are a creative tool for journalists, but it doesn't mean the public or the audience likes them, or you're enabling them to become more trusting in you because you use them. I have a different scenario that I always like to use as an example. You do have that sidewalk right, the right to put that camera on the sidewalk and point it at a public building. But do you want to do that in all contexts? If there was a major incident at the high school in your town, do you really want to be putting the camera on the sidewalk willy-nilly shooting kids coming or going from a high school? Isn't that going to have some kickback? Aren't you going to be alarming the administrators, the kids, and ultimately their parents? And is that good for your brand? Is it good for your news organization to have parents unsettled, students unsettled, the community unsettled? Just because you have the right doesn't mean it's always judicious to use it.
Vikram, do you have any ethical advice, or do you want to stay out of that one?
I would just say, you know, a lot of questions that I get, they're really not legal questions. They're ethical questions. They're standards questions. So, you know, most news organizations have an ethics policy. They have a standards policy. They may even have a standards department with people who just do this all day long. So, you know, I would really recommend that journalists work with those members of their organization to learn what is the ethics policy, what is our standard, and it may vary between, a lot of news organizations have different newsrooms. There may be different policies for each newsroom.
One of the greatest code of ethics, if you're just starting out to work from, the RTDNA Code of Ethics is a great one to start with. It hangs in many newsrooms. It hung in mine for many years. It hangs in a lot of the Tegna newsrooms. And it really covers so many, from taking extra care when it comes to children, as Scott mentioned. It talks about social media. But if you're looking and you're starting out, I would suggest that, even if you've been in it for decades, it's a great one to look through. And many people have taken part in putting that together.
Before we get to the questions that are being posted on Facebook Live and those in the audience who want to ask a question as well of the panel, we have one final one that we collected from the EIJ event about a month ago. Let's take a listen to that.
That's not here, so I'll say it. I was informed. How, in this day and age, can you differentiate free speech and hate speech? That was the student's question coming off of what happened at UF. I think it's pretty relevant. Vikram, do you want to weigh in? Or Paul?
I mean, I think the strictly legal answer is there isn't a distinction. Hate speech is protected speech under the First Amendment. That's not an ethical answer. That's just a lawyer's answer. In terms of how you distinguish it otherwise, I'll leave that to others.
And I think that's why UF
right, exactly.
was in a position where they had to let Richard
right, and UF,
speak.
and that's a crucial point as we deal with this issue about speakers on campus. UF is a public university, so they were, they weren't required to invite him, Richard Spencer, but once he's invited,
or once he's paying $10,000.
He was not invited.
Oh, he's
paid. He was paying $10,000 for the space, and just like anybody else, they have to say yes.
That's correct.
And he was allowing the journalists he wanted to enter the room and barring ones that he did not.
And which he did allow. We have a station in Jacksonville, so he did allow all journalists in.
No. Yeah. But this is almost parallel to the point Vikram made at the beginning. To the extent that anyone has the right to pay $10,000 to speak at University of Florida and then control who comes in, Richard Spencer can't be denied that right just because his speech is abhorrent, even though it is abhorrent.
Yeah.
But private universities, very different situation.
Yeah, I would just say, no rights are absolute. There's always a balancing test. There's a First Amendment right to a free press. Defendants have a Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial. Sometimes those are in tension. The students at schools have a right to an education. They have the administrators have a right to worry about public safety also. So I think that the balancing test is messy and it's intentionally so.
Let's take a couple other topics before we get to some questions. I'm curious your opinion on sourcing in these divisive times, where anonymous sourcing is being used as a card against the media. How do you feel about the use of anonymous sources now?
We have a set of standards, and we make those standards even more challenging when we give the anonymous sources access to our broadcast spectrum. If we put them on camera in a silhouette or disguise their voice, you have to reach certain levels before you approve it. And it has to go through several different managers, which I bet is a best practice for you all too.
Absolutely, and it has to be, first off, a manager needs to know who that source is, and it needs to be collaborated. We don't just go, if that is the only person giving us that piece of information, we cannot get that collaborated with other people. We would not go with that. There are national organizations and other organizations. Local journalists tend to have a much higher bar that I see where things are being lack of attribution and anonymous and unnamed sources are used much more frequently than local journalists do.
I want to weigh in there because some of the work that we do at Real Media Group, we work with student and new professional reporters on scripts. And more than ever, I see scripts without attribution. Can you, I guess from both perspectives, from a manager's perspective and from a legal perspective, it is so important, the attribution part, especially in a broadcast. It could save you. Ellen, can you speak to that? I mean, you nodded your head, or you said you're seeing it more, but what would you say to young journalists?
Yeah, it's the basic rule of journalism is there's attribution, but one of the things that just because someone else said it, you are still responsible for it if it is not true. And that's something that people seem to forget. If it is false, and even though someone else says it, you're still responsible for putting that into your story.
So allegedly isn't always safe.
No.
but still a good idea.
Yes.
And the one
I hate that word, but you know.
Yes. And the one exception to that, and that's an extraordinarily important point, the one exception to that is when you're reporting about official proceedings. So if you're reporting about a criminal case or even a civil case, and Joe Blow accuses this person of assaulting him, if you reported that allegation outside the context of a legal proceeding, you would have to own it. If what you're doing is reporting on a legal proceeding and you make clear that you are reporting on a legal proceeding and you accurately represent the substance of the legal proceeding, it's fair game even if it turns out to be completely false.
Let's circle back to what is the large topic here and the reason why we've convened. It's the attack of credibility of journalists right now. And you kind of touched on this, that getting into a shouting war that what we're doing is real and not fake is not going to work, right? So how do you balance informing the public the reasons behind the reporting and defend against charges of political bias?
Transparency is, I think, one of the greatest things that we can do, which kind of gets to what we were just talking about. And it's one of the things that we're working on at Tegna is, and we've done a little bit of research on this, where we show, it's kind of like in elementary math, show our work a little bit more. How did we get to that? And we did a couple stories back to back, and one where we just assume and we say the story, and it moves a little faster and it's a little bit slicker, and one that goes a little bit slower, but we lay out our sources and how we got to the conclusion that we did, and explain where our sources came from. And it was funny. In the room, we showed it, the one that's a little bit longer, a little drawn out more, a few more graphics, an explanation of how we got to that story. And the reporters and the managers in the room are all like, oh, that's so long and kind of boring. But the citizens, if you will, the laymen in the room were like, I like that one better. I trust that one better. And we all learned from that. People need to trust us more. They need to know our processes more. So that is something that we're working on. It's something that we call Verify, that we're doing across all of our stations, where we're laying out our process more often in our investigative work and taking them through our journey step by step on how we got to things. That's one way we can do it. It doesn't answer all of that, but transparency, I think, is helpful.
How are you dealing day to day on the idea of political bias involved in your reporting?
It's amazing how much more prevalent this concern is than it was a year ago, 2 years ago. It's really a part of our daily thought process. And Ellen's idea is the right one. You show your work in what we call process language, process writing. Show what you did to get to this point so that nobody can question your motives or question your approach, to make sure that nobody can accuse you of partisanship or having an agenda. That requires a little more airtime, which, by the way, in the broadcast spectrum is hard to come by. You might need an extra minute of airtime, and that's a difficult fight to fight sometimes. But I also believe, without equivocation, the future of journalism in a crowded space is enterprise and investigative. Things you can't find on your phone right now. Things you didn't hear 5 times before the newscast began or before you opened up that page on the website. And if there is more and more demand for investigative content and enterprising content, you will be able to go longer, show your work, and do process language more thoroughly.
Any advice from the lawyers for the lack of the assumption of credibility these days?
I mean, from a legal perspective, I mean, that doesn't matter. Right. You know, if it's biased, that's fine. You have a First Amendment right to be as biased as you want to be. The one area in which it makes a difference, to some extent, if you think about a case going to trial, jurors are like the kind of people you were describing. And so, you know, I had a case over a year ago. There was a privacy case in which, you know, my client had published something about a public figure that he didn't want published. And one of the refrains at trial was, well, you never asked him whether it was really him on this tape or something like that. And from a lawyer perspective, we were thinking, well, that doesn't matter. You know, we got the story. It was accurate what we reported. You just didn't want us to report it, but you don't have the right to tell us what to report. But to the jury, it made a difference. The jury sort of wanted to know that there was some gesture of fairness to sort of reach out to someone and say, we're going to publish this. What do you think? So, I mean, that's the way it would matter.
You have a thought on this?
I mean, I work in public media, so it's very clear, you know, from the mission of the organization that it's about serving the community. You know, we're public charity. We're doing good work. I think, you know, many commercial outlets feel the same way, but because they're commercial, the public assumes, oh, it's just profit-driven. It's just about the buck. It's just about, you know. So if there's a way to fix that, I think that would be good.
At the end of the Tegna Code of Ethics, there's, you know, we know our rights and all of that, but at the end of it, it states, above all else, do the right thing. So know your rights, but above all else, do the right thing. And authenticity, asking the fair thing, do the right thing. If more journalists thought of that, we'd be in a better spot.
Let's move on to our questions and answers. We have a couple microphones set up here, so if someone here locally would like to say something, please line up. Karen Hansen from RTDNA is getting questions that are being fielded on Facebook Live right now. And why don't we start with that, Karen? Are you prepared for a first question for our panel?
Sure. So we've got lots of student groups listening online. We've got American University. We've got the University of New Hampshire. And we had a question that came up a few times, actually. What about social media posts? Is that public property? Is that private? What can we use? Do we need to ask for permission first?
Nothing on social media is ever private. That is a good rule of thumb.
Right. There might be copyright reasons not to use things on social media or to use them in a very particular way that protects your ability to use it. But in terms of public versus private, no.
Be careful about those images, though, right?
Yes.
I mean, photos on
Right.
social media
Right.
may be professionally taken. And you don't have rights from the professional photo taker to use. And I'm not an attorney, so it's scary when I start talking like one. But I think professional photo takers are very protective of their livelihood and their pictures. Just because I post a photo on Facebook doesn't mean you can take it and use it in media, because I didn't give you permission from the photographer.
Right, and that's the real danger with social media and reporting is copyright intellectual property. It's not violating people's right to privacy.
Very quickly on Twitter, because of its limited nature of which you can make a thought, context of using something that was off of that medium, how do you handle dealing with getting that in proper context?
Meaning the reporting is being done via Twitter?
You are citing something that someone said on Twitter, but it's been done in such a short sample size that you are trying to put that into a proper context.
The lack of number of characters does not allow you to be inaccurate. How's that for it? It does not, accuracy is accuracy. So that's one of our rules of thumb, is the lack of number of characters doesn't mean that it cannot be any less accurate than it is on broadcast or on any other platform.
Just a quick follow-up. What about like a direct message, right, on whether it be Twitter or Facebook? Are you allowed to take screen captures of that for your reporting? Is that still all sort of considered public, even though it's private? I don't know, from a lawyer's perspective, Paul?
I mean, it depends on how you get it, right? If you hack into someone else's Facebook account and steal direct messages, you shouldn't do that. But if it's a direct message to you, I mean, it's just a document.
Right.
Right. It's one caveat about public versus private that just occurred to me. If you're reporting about social media use by children, and I know there's this age, I don't know how old you have to be to use Facebook, it's going to be slightly different. So use judgment if you're talking about, if a high school, if a 15-year-old inadvertently, posts something on Facebook she really shouldn't have, use judgment about that sort of thing.
Got it.
And I would also say that, social media is not a monolith. It's very platform specific. So the rules of Facebook are very different from the terms of service that apply to Twitter, that apply to, Snapchat, anything else. So, answer your question, the terms of service may say that,
right.
Everything that happens on Facebook is a property of, Facebook, you can't use it without a license, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important to find that out before you start using it.
And we always say, if somebody, if you are a reporter and they're sending you a direct message as a reporter and you're obviously a reporter, they're sending you, and your call letters are on there and everything, they're sending a reporter a direct message, right? The right thing to do would be, hey, can I use this, right? So that's...
Right, but also assume they know who they're sending to.
Yeah, they know who they're sending to. So those would be the questions I'm asking,
sure.
As a manager.
Would you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hi, I'm Deanne Divis. I'm with Inside Unmanned Systems magazine, also a member of SPJ. I'd like to follow up on the story that you guys had in the hotel and ask about private organizations organizing meetings where you have government officials meeting with perhaps business people or other members of the public. But
yeah, right.
In one example, the private organization's internal communications folks are allowed to be there, and they have their own newsletters and stuff, but not other reporters. And in another case, which I've seen more than once, where the fact that reporters are barred is specifically in the materials for the conference. And so everybody can come but the journalists, and I was struck by the comments about they can't treat you differently, but I'm not sure where the lines are. Can you explain?
Right. That was the whole gist of the story that we exposed. So your questions were our questions. And that was what we were exposing to the state of Georgia in that story, in that the best way to do it is we were exposing that the people's business was being done behind closed doors, that laws were being written by lobbyists and being handed to government officials behind closed doors. And what you are stating was exactly what we were trying to expose, and that they weren't allowing the press in to see that, is what we were calling foul on.
For the lawyers, is there a mechanism to I don't know, to deal with that? Do you have to say, okay, I can't come in? Expose it, yes, but is there, when you've got everybody but the journalists who are allowed to attend a meeting, how does that play out legally?
I mean, if it's literally open to the public, except journalists, that's not acceptable. But it is acceptable for a private organization to invite who they want to invite to their meeting. I mean, the point that was made earlier is, your way to get access to a meeting like that is through leverage and embarrass them. I mean, there's really
and
nothing
so
else.
That's what we were doing, because
Right.
what they were doing, the letter of the law was okay, but the issue to keep this practice going was not. So what we could do to help our community be better was to expose it to stop the practice from going. Because by the letter of the law, what they were doing was okay.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Peggy Sanzorchowski. I'm a permalancer for two publications. One's a Hispanic outlook on higher education, and I've been covering DACA for them for over 10, not DACA, Dreamers, for over 10 years. The other is the Georgetowner, and I cover the Georgetown University, of course. So DACA is a really, really big issue for me. And there's two issues that's just really making it difficult to get to the truth. And so one of them happened yesterday at the Center for American Progress. They had a big panel, all advocates, of course, for DACA. And the Georgetown University communication, new officer, now permanent, she was before half-time, now she's full-time, just for DACA, to protect DACA students was there. So I asked her, how many students are there? How many are you? Oh, well, she couldn't tell me that, of course. We can't tell you numbers because that, and this is an excuse you always get with the university, that you have to protect the privacy of the students. I'm just asking for a general number. I want to know how much your salary is. I'll get that otherwise. But, you know, how many students are we protecting here? The other thing, unfortunately, is the press. And this is something you were just talking about as far as credibility. Everybody in the press talks about DACA as being kids who were brought in by their parents at a very early age, brought in illegally by their parents at a very early age. None of those words, none of them, appear in either the DACA order or in any of the Dreamer legislation. The defining description of a Dreamer is anybody who came in or entered, the verbs are really important here, the country before the age of 16. Now that's a very different image than parents, I like to call them cooing-carrying parents, bringing in a little child. Ed Henry even said, oh, they were infants when they brought in. I don't know where he gets that. It's not anywhere in any official documents. But the press continues to spin this story as if they're all little children. But those kids who are assaulting walls, those teenagers who are assaulting walls, those are Dreamers too. They can apply too. You come in legally with an H-1B parent and you overstay your visa. You just have to be here illegally on a certain date. So the press is not getting this story right. They're spinning it for the advocate's point of view. And it's really hard. I come off as some kind of bigot when I mention, well, you know, they weren't all little kids when they came in. And of course, all Dreamers now, by definition, are millennials. They're 18 to 32 years old. They're not children.
Do you have a question?
So my question is, how do I deal with, especially the university, constantly using the privacy of students to not give you information?
Let me address that issue broadly. I can't get into DACA, but I can get into how to do investigations or using your rights in educational facilities. Right. Private universities are a puzzle, but they're a bit of a puzzle, I'll admit. Right, right. Public universities, and more importantly, I think, public schools will necessarily and are supposed to invoke privacy to keep you from getting student records and, more frustratingly, to keep you from getting educator records. If a teacher does something wrong at a public university or at a public school, that school district has the right, and I think in every state, to withhold the employment information, withhold the records about that misconduct because employee information at schools is private. But they cannot withhold it at the government agency that oversees public universities or public schools. If you suspect there's a case of misconduct in your high school, in your community, you can't ask for that teacher's record from the school, but you can ask for that record from the State Department of Education, to whom the school must report. So we're always looking for back doors to get truth from government. Public universities have to report up to somebody. Public schools have to report up to somebody. If you think John Doe did something wrong in your community school, that school district can hold it back from you, but the state can't. So make sure you're going to all avenues, all regulators, to get information about what's happening at a school. You'd be surprised how effective it is. What's more, you'd be surprised how few people try it.
But private schools,
private schools are a puzzle. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Trevor. I'm a reporter with Cronkite News, Arizona PBS. And I just had a question because I'm starting out in my career, graduating in December, so I really need to know a few things. I was reporting on unemployment numbers in Arizona just a few months ago, and I went to a local state office. I had my camera, because I'm broadcast, and I was confronted by a security guard. He came out and said, hey, we own the building, we own the parking lot, you cannot be here. So I said, well, what about the sidewalk? Is that okay? So he said yes, went out, did my thing on the sidewalk, but then he told me I can't even point my camera at the building because it's owned by the state. It's state property. So my question is two-part. A, is he correct in telling me that I have to be on the sidewalk and cannot shoot the building? And B, would it have been illegal for he or a cop to come along and say, hey, I need your footage? Like, you cannot film, I need your footage, I need your camera, anything like that.
Paul, Vikram?
You can shoot the building from the sidewalk. That's pretty well established. And if a police officer came and tried to seize your footage, yes, that would not be permissible. The thing to do then is to call a lawyer right away. Lawyers love that. That's their favorite thing, to run to court and deal with what's, typically the jargon there is a prior restraint, which is a restraint on the ability to publish information in advance of the actual publication of the information. Lawyers love that. But no, they would not have a right to seize that. There were cases this has been litigated recently and the law is now pretty settled, but so in general, you're permitted to be on a sidewalk, but the government is permitted to regulate speech on sidewalks subject to what are called reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And so for years, if you tried to film police officers would say, what you're doing is disruptive of what I'm doing, and try to seize the footage. And those issues work their way through the courts, and the courts have sort of unanimously held that you have a right to film police officers. The case you're dealing with is a much easier case because you're not even in theory disrupting law enforcement. So that's an easy case.
It's not the last time you fought that battle.
Right.
That's going to happen and happen and happen.
Right.
And this is why I
get used to it, I suppose.
Yes.
Right. So in any case, and maybe not any, but if it's a riot, if it's a protest, if it's something where police or authority figures are there, they cannot seize my camera or my footage?
Depending on where you are, right.
How can we explain this in that they will, they have, and you can win it later, but I've had, at protests, I've had reporters arrested and I've had their cameras taken, and they call us right away and we tell them stay calm, we're on our way, and we get it back and whatever. So to say, can they? Yes. Should they? No. I mean, I don't.
Right. And my understanding is the police departments are doing a better job of educating themselves about the law in that area. But that's exactly right. They should not do that, but they're still doing it.
As a contrarian, let me just go back to the old point. Just because you have a right doesn't mean you want to exercise it. Is there a real reason they don't want you to take a picture of the building? Are children there? Is there a domestic abuse counselor in that building and some of the clients are walking in and out at that moment? Just be careful. I mean, be judicious about how you exercise a right. Make sure there isn't a genuine reason they don't want you to take a picture of the building. Doesn't sound like there was in that scenario, but keep that in mind moving forward.
In worst case, I can get my camera back later with all the footage?
Yes,
you should.
Oh, absolutely,
okay.
yes.
I mean, the worst case is you bring what's called a 1983 lawsuit. You bring a federal lawsuit for violation of your First Amendment rights. I mean, that's the mechanism the way those things play out.
And what we've had happen is a letter of apology from the mayor, and situations like that happen. Yep.
Hey, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Zach Everson. I'm a freelance journalist, most recently for Condé Nast Traveler. Question for Scott. Earlier this month, you ran an article, or a story rather, where you put cameras in a vehicle and had it valet parked at the Trump Hotel D.C. to monitor the hotel's security. What internal deliberations did you have before doing that, and how are those impacted by the owner of the Trump Hotel D.C.'s litigious history?
Don't speak about deliberations with counsel.
Fair enough. Zach, it's a good question. I appreciate you watching the story. I think that the fundamental dynamic when you put cameras into something, are you hiding them or not? We didn't. Our cameras were notorious and open for anybody to see. And I think that is always an important distinction when you talk about camera use. Is it notorious? Can anybody else see you're filming or using photography? And I think that changes the dynamic significantly. It goes from hidden camera to camera. And I think if we were trying to employ hidden cameras, that might have required a different conversation with counsel than we had.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach.
Karen, you want to do another Facebook Live?
Sure.
Yeah, just one more question on Facebook Live from students at American University. Do you have advice for reporters on how to diffuse situations that might get hostile? It's important to stand your ground, but you also don't want to get hurt or put yourself in real physical danger.
Yeah, things will get hostile, and it ultimately, I'm surprised by the unexpected times when it does. You go to a major rally, or you go to a gathering of people who have, a very charged way about them. That might not actually be so hostile. It's the unexpected moments. And I go back to, this is not so much a legal question, it is a standards question. Do you look good engaging in a fight or in an argument on camera as a journalist? Again, we have this hurdle that's growing. People think we are fake. People think we have an agenda. People think we are politically biased. Doesn't that infuse or inflame the situation, even if we think we're in the right? I'm very conscious of who I pursue on camera and who I don't, and how I go about doing it. In over cautiousness on being polite, being respectful, using the phrase ma'am and sir, not running, not chasing, not pointing that microphone cartoonishly in the face of somebody. Not because I don't have a right to, but because I don't look good. And as a journalist, I don't want to inflame the situation anymore.
And we've talked a lot today about your right to shoot something, your right to shoot, but people have a right to not have their picture taken, even though you have the right to shoot too. And, to just ask first, even though you don't have to. Always ends up with not having people angry and upset. So when you can ask first, when you can show who you are and what you're doing and explain the process, keeps things calmer. But always being polite, knowing that every time you go out, you are representing not just yourself, but you're representing your television station, your website, the entire organization that you're working for. Remembering that every time that you go out, I think is really important. And I think every journalist should take conflict resolution and knowing how to diffuse the situation.
And I'd also say, don't assume the worst. Some of these are very complicated questions. Just like, most journalists aren't experts in media law. Most government officials you interact with are not experts in media law. They don't know. They may not know better. They may not be trying to be hostile. They just don't know that what you're doing is okay. And they may be perfectly fine with letting you do what you want to do once they find out it's okay. They just don't know. They may report to a boss. That boss may not know. So just try not to assume that they're out to get you and they're intentionally trying to stop you from doing your job.
It's one of the elements of the RTDNA Code of Ethics is to take extra caution when dealing with those who don't normally deal with the media. So things that we take for granted, like pointing a camera or turning it on or holding a mic flag, that we're just, that's just what we do. People might, what are you doing? Or what does that mean? Explaining the process to people and explaining why you're there and what your story is about and how you're going to edit it can really help people feel at ease and trust you more.
Hi, Mark Sherman, former print journalist in trade publications. The other day there was a story on public television about Scott Pruitt and how he got to his position at the EPA, his involvement with the Republican attorneys general, and the lobbyists who were involved in helping draft legislation or memos or things like that. And as a piece of journalism, I thought, well, this is very interesting information, and I watched it avidly. But while I was watching, I noticed something else that I thought could be construed as a type of bias in response to your point earlier about being self-critical. And it was the music that accompanied this documentary footage. It was calculated to induce a feeling of fear and foreboding and evil and lurking and conspiratorial events. And I just, as an observer, I thought, you're framing a guilty man. You're trying to get me to take a particular point of view that your actual journalism would be perfectly sufficient for. So I'm just wondering whether you have any policies about the use of music as overkill.
That's interesting. We don't have an overall policy of use of music, but that is something that we try to be very careful with. And one of the things that we try and do with special pieces like that is have a wide variety of people watch a piece, because you seeing that piece brought something in that maybe the 3 editors that were working on it didn't even feel. But having a wide variety, diverse set of people watching pieces see it can bring that set of sensibilities into it. So that's great feedback. That's great feedback.
Some of that's somewhat counterintuitive to a lot of journalists who are so protective of their content and of their intellectual property. They don't want to show anybody until they show the world.
Right.
That's a best practice. The more people that see your work before you put your work out helps flag things that any reasonable viewer or reader may find objectionable that you didn't think about. And I think that's a great practice she's got. Is
there a legal discussion about production elements, not just music, but in general what he's getting to, which is inflicting a certain level of tone?
Absolutely, that in the Tegna Code of Ethics that we will not use technology and editing to manipulate the context of our stories so that it slants or changes the context of the stories.
How about in public radio? You guys have very long, highly produced pieces. What is the discussion about in terms of context and using production elements?
You know, frankly, I don't know. I think music is a very fraught topic just from a rights perspective, because music is a bundle of rights. It's not just one right. So the composer has rights, the arranger has rights, the performer has rights. So I think in general, journalists don't use music that often because using it involves so much rights clearance that when you do use it, you have to be very clear as to why you're using it, and there has to be a real reason that you're doing it, just because it's such an involved process.
And over the years, I had a professor, Dow Smith, that never let us use music because of just that, because music means different things to different people's souls, right? And so it evokes different slants to it. But in nowadays, people are so used to wanting their news to be a little more interesting and entertaining, so the music tends to help it move along and to be interesting, and the production levels are of a different stance. So we're there.
There's a lot here too. I mean, there's color of graphics, placement of graphics, when a wipe is used, how a story is actually edited, how quickly there's sound bites, the sound effects that are used. There's a lot of production elements that can bring about what he's discussing.
Did you make it black and white in sections? For visual contrast, the same way campaign ads are when they're negative campaign ads. I would just say, to Ellen's point, music is fraught with risk, but music is also so tempting now because our mission is to make you look up from your iPad and look up from your phone. And we'll employ any audio technique we can find to make you do that. That's our competition.
Okay, my name is Emma Austin with a group of students from Western Kentucky University School of Journalism. A couple of us work for our school paper, which right now is getting sued by our university. Last year, we requested Title IX records, records of Title IX investigations for employee misconduct, sexual misconduct, and the university refused to give those to us. Then our attorney general said they had to, so then they sued us so that they could keep fighting that. And I don't want to get too much into specifics, but last semester, well, we had heard people saying that our university president at the time had been telling people that we were reporting inaccurately on the case. So we reached out to him to see if he would meet with our editorial board to address that. And we did have a meeting, but I guess he canceled it and then sent us an op-ed kind of reiterating why the university wouldn't give us those records. So we ran the op-ed with a column from our opinion editor, just reiterating why we wanted the records in the first place. And again, not to get too much into specifics, but we, after that, we got an email from our general counsel at the university saying basically that the administration would not comment further on the case, like going from then on out reporting, and we weren't really sure how to handle that response from the administration. I was just wondering if you all had advice for us reporting on the lawsuit going from here.
I'm not your attorney, so I can't give you advice. Is the paper independent, or does it receive funds from the university?
Well, We completely self-funded, like from our advertising staff. They like pay for our electricity building, but that's it. So we're independent.
Okay. I mean, you know, the legal process of getting these records will play out the way it plays out. To the extent you're independent, the university has no obligation to cooperate with your reporting. They don't have to give you statements if they don't want to. At the same time, it's a public university, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so they can't, I mean, if it's getting to the point where, you feel the paper and the students who work on the paper are being retaliated against in ways sort of independent of just we're not giving you a statement, but it's affecting more broadly, that could, this is hypothetical, rise to the level of a First Amendment violation, right? Because you'd be retaliated against for your protected speech. But I mean, that's all I can say in the abstract.
You do have some leverage. I mean, you've already, it sounds like you've employed some of it, Emma, in your reporting. But the process that's playing out is news and can be reported on. And ultimately, that gives you some bullets in your gun, metaphorically, to get some better access from the university and get better responses from the university. I mean, if I were a news director, I would recommend a drumbeat of stories, because this is interesting, and it's news, especially to your audience, which is the university's own students.
Yeah, the university is not cooperating with its own students in an investigation for materials by which they have a right to receive. That's an interesting story.
Has a local newspaper or website or TV station picked up the story?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
Keep it up.
Yeah,
Thank
good luck.
you.
We have just 3 minutes left, so quick question.
Hi, I'm Harvard. I'm a freelance journalist. Just wanted to get your input on so the politicalization of the news business, the polarization of people, on a actually personal basis, grassroots basis. I have found myself on Facebook with relatives of mine who post fake news or news that has a really bad spin on it, inaccurate spin. And so, I mean, one way is to, as you said, do really great journalism and try to educate the public. But can we do this on a grassroots level or in Facebook? I find myself going hours and hours into something just to dispute what's on Facebook so that these poor people aren't, having the wool pulled over their eyes, even if they want to see it a certain way. So just any comment on that?
Of how we as individuals can...
For real fake news that pops up on Facebook a lot.
Yes.
And a lot of people believe it. So how, as real journalists, how do we counter that? Maybe on a personal basis, maybe on Facebook. How do we do that?
I know, just because we work with Facebook, that there are practices in place to flag fake news. I don't know all of it, but you can absolutely contact them or at least go to their journalism page. They have a really great resource where you can find information about that. I know that from the social network itself.
I like that I understood the phrase "real fake news." I knew what you meant.
Yeah, exactly.
Ellen's strategy earlier is the only one to counter it with, I think, is to work your way out of it. Continue to show a differentiation between real brand name news in your community, and fake stuff that posts on social media. And the best way to do that is to include your community in your reporting. Make sure your reporting looks like your community, has the same diversity, interests, same priorities. And that'll really make the contrast startling and should be less deceptive to your friends on Facebook.
And keep doing that. Keep correcting it and letting people know that, this is why this is wrong, and here's links to the truth. Keep doing that. Keep fighting the fight.
So you guys are emphasizing sourcing now a little bit more than in the past. You want people to see that now,
See
right?
how you
It's
make the
important.
dinner. I think one of the most important things to show, to make clear you don't have an agenda, is why are we pursuing this story in the first place?
Yes.
What led us to this area of interest? To make sure it's clear to our audience we don't have an agenda or something we're trying to push, but here's why we thought this was important, and here's why we're doing it in the first place. At least show that part of your work.
Authentic transparency.
I think we're out of time.
We are. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all on Facebook Live. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to RTDNA. Thank you to the Press Club as well. And we'll be here for a few more minutes if you have some questions for us here live.